Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. This episode will be unusual. Some time ago, we considered the work of Basil the Great, especially in terms of its influence on later Christian social doctrine. Today, I want to revisit Basil's life in order to compare his social vision with that of his most powerful contemporary, the Emperor Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate. Both Basil and Julian were gifted leaders. Both were bright, brave, and disciplined men. Both were steeped in tradition, and both wanted to find new ways of expressing ancient traditions they revered. Both placed their lives at the service of a certain ideal of social order. Both, in fact, were raised in a Christian tradition that stretched back more than 300 years. Basil owned that tradition and tried to move it forward. Julian despised it and tried to supplant it. Well, the document known as the Didache is one of the most important early witnesses to that tradition. Outside the New Testament, it is probably the oldest Christian text that has survived. Some parts of it are probably older than the books of the New Testament, and some passages may predate Christianity. The word Didache means simply teaching. The Didache claimed to be the body of teaching the apostles had left regarding how to run a church, how to fashion and sustain a Christian society out of many individual Christian lives. So revered was this book in the early church that it was sometimes listed among the inspired books. The Didache begins with these words: "Two ways there are, one of life and one of death. And there is a great difference between the two ways." There are two ways. Each way, according to the Didache, involves certain actions and certain omissions, and each of these actions or omissions contributes to the making of a certain kind of society. Keep that in mind as we turn again to Basil and Julian, who split the two ways between them. Each took a particular road, and each would say with Robert Frost that made all the difference. Their ways, their visions, their ideals were not morally equivalent. They were opposites. Indeed, perhaps both men would agree that their two ways were rivals in a great cosmic drama. Both Julian and Basil were students together in Athens in 355 AD. Both were then in their 20s. Both had been raised in Christian families. Let's take a look at their two ways one by one. We'll begin with Basil. In episode 29, we considered Basil's life in some detail. We saw that he was born into a large and loving Christian family. His ancestors included martyrs, and even his parents had suffered a bit for the faith. Basil's father was a professor of rhetoric who homeschooled his children. He died when Basil was a teenager, and Basil continued his academic studies at prestigious schools, first in his native Cappadocia, then for a year in the imperial capital, Constantinople, and finally for 6 years at Athens. It was there, in the 350s, that Basil and Julian converged. This was the 4th century's Ivy League, where the rich and powerful went to get their training in life. Both Basil and Julian studied under Libanius, the most famous rhetorician of their time. Libanius was an ardent proponent of the old religion, the pagan religion, but he did not let this stand in the way of his training of great Christian men. Among his students were, besides Basil and Julian, John Chrysostom and Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory, in fact, became Basil's closest friend while they were at Athens. They were housemates and shared a common life of philosophical study, prayer, and fasting. Basil returned to Cappadocia to teach in 355. At that time, Basil had a spiritual awakening that led him to take up the contemplative life in seclusion. With a small group of family and friends, he lived as a monk on his family's estate. The fruit of his contemplation poured forth in his writing. His theological works and his letters drew attention for their erudition and their style. His old classmate Julian, now emperor, tried to entice Basil to life at court, but Basil refused. Basil was ordained a priest around 362 and made an auxiliary bishop shortly afterward. It was a time of doctrinal crisis in the church, but also social crisis. In 368, a series of natural calamities, including hailstorms, floods, and earthquakes, brought famine to the lands of Cappadocia. Basil was appalled when some merchants seized the opportunity to grow rich from the scarcity of food, leaving the poor to starve. Basil's preaching shamed the wealthy and led them to share what they had. He led by example as well, as he sold his inheritance and gave the proceeds over to relief efforts. It was Basil's management of these crises that established his reputation with the Christian people. When his bishop died in 370, Basil was made the bishop of Caesarea, and he served in that capacity until his death in 379. Historians say that Basil was the first to produce a sustained theological reflection on the church's social concerns, and his ideas found institutional form as he built a vast campus known as the Basileidas. The locals called it the New City, and it included a soup kitchen, poorhouses, a trade school, a hostel for needy travelers, personal care for the elderly, and a hospice for the dying. His staff of monks and nuns dispensed food and medical care, but Basil insisted that the duty to serve the poor was not just a peculiarity of monks and nuns. It applied to all Christians. He accepted relief from the imperial government, and he even argued for it, but he was unwilling to trade it for influence. He was consistently keen to defend the rights of the church against encroachments by secular power. He refused Julian's invitation to serve at court. He declined similar overtures from his provincial governors. Basil's classmate Julian was similar to the great saint in many ways. They were both brilliant intellectuals with mighty ambitions. They were both disciplined men who could defer pleasures and gratifications for the sake of a chosen cause. They both modeled fortitude for their followers, Julian's in the army and Basil's in the church. Both men loom colossal in the history of their time, and that's impressive, since Basil did not live to see his 50th birthday, and Julian reigned for less than 3 years. So we come to Julian. Julian was born in 331 into a brutal family and a bloody business. His father was the Emperor Constantine's half-brother. One historian notes that Julian's family spent a great deal of their days developing ingenious ways to kill each other. The motive was usually intrigue, grabs for the throne, or just the suspicion bred by such an atmosphere. In 326, Constantine ordered the execution of his own wife and eldest son. The 3 remaining sons succeeded their father in 337 and rather quickly dispatched almost all their male relatives. Only 2 young boys were spared, 5-year-old Julian and his teenage brother Gallus. Julian was too young to be a threat, and Gallus too sickly. Though Julian continued to live the privileged life of the imperial family, he kept the memory of that purge, whose victims included his own father, and he nursed the grudge. Years later, he would write with incredulity of his cousin, the Emperor Constantius. Our fathers were brothers, sons of the same father, and close relations as we were, how this most humane emperor treated us. He put to death 6 of our cousins, my father, who was his uncle, another of our uncles on my father's side, and my eldest brother, all without trial. The imperial family was officially Christian by this time, and the irony was not lost on Julian, who was himself raised a Christian. Constantius the murderer professed the doctrine of Jesus Christ. It doesn't take a psychiatrist to locate the origins of Julian's anti-Christian drive. But Julian learned to keep his thoughts to himself. Constantius was his patron, and alienation from the emperor meant certain death. So Julian studied diligently. With Basil and Gregory, he took up philosophy and rhetoric at Athens and secretly began his investigations of the old religion, the pagan mysteries. He found a group that secretly practiced the old rituals, and he joined them. Though he kept up his outward practice of Christianity, his mind and heart now belonged to the old gods. Appointed to leadership in the military, Julian rose rapidly with some stunning campaigns in the western provinces and barbarian lands. He gained a reputation for toughness. Unlike other generals, he shared the hardships of his troops. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and he rewarded them handsomely. All this made for tenacious loyalty. Not surprisingly, they eventually declared him emperor. So in 360, Julian began to march toward Byzantium to confront his cousin Constantius. But the meeting never happened. Constantius died of natural causes while Julian was on the way. Then began the reign that gave Julian his place in history. Julian did some great things. He did some things extremely well. Tax reform, for example, and military leadership. But no one remembers Julian as a tax reformer, or even much as a general. He is remembered as the apostate, the man who renounced Christianity in a public and forcefully institutional way. The Christian church had enjoyed the favor of emperors for a half-century, but Julian made clear that his reign would be different. He immediately made vast sums available to restore temples that had fallen into disrepair through a generation of Christian rule and pagan decline. He promoted pagans to prominent positions in the capital and boosted the wages of the pagan priesthoods. He tried, at least in the beginning, to include Christians in his dawning era of toleration. As I said, he invited Basil to take a seat at the imperial court, but the church's big names were wary. Basil refused the honor, and Julian became more hardened in his anti-Christian position. Pagan restoration became the keynote of his rule. He wrote a philosophical takedown of the Christian religion titled Against the Galileans. Yet Julian's paganism was not really the old religion. It was rather a mirror image of Christianity. It was an anti-church, a reactionary project. Julian himself recognized Christianity's influence on his ideas. You can take the emperor out of the church, but you can't take the church out of the emperor. Julian's greatest recent biographer, Adrian Murdoch, wrote, Julian's attempt at creating a pagan doctrine betray his Christian upbringing. By the very fact of his early education, he was already, as he would have put it, polluted. Whereas the old religion had been a riot of gods, cults, and feasts, Julian strove in a very Roman way to impose unity and uniformity on worldwide polytheism. And it was the religious equivalent of herding cats. In Julian's scheme, the emperor himself served as a sort of pope over a hierarchy that mirrored the Catholic structure of archbishops, bishops, and priests. He set up pagan philanthropies in imitation of Catholic charities. He urged his clergy to lead lives of virtue and preach philosophy to the people. Julian himself had chosen to lead a celibate life after the death of his wife. As Adrian Murdoch puts it, he wanted the pagans to out-Christian the Christians. Julian despised Christianity and led the charge to repaganize the empire, but he could not help but imitate Catholicism if he wanted to succeed at establishing a religion and implementing his social and cultural program. In his letters, he grudgingly admitted admiration for Christian charity. To one man he vented, "The impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our poor lack aid from us." His pagan coming out climaxed during an extended stay in Syrian Antioch, a city of 500,000 people situated en route to the battlegrounds where he would meet the Persians. While in Antioch, Julian renewed the pagan practices, though he was hardly satisfied with the priest's performances. He showed himself to be as prissy and uptight as any of history's most fanatical Puritans. In Antioch, a city known for its comedians and satirists, the majority Christian population openly laughed at Julian's efforts. This infuriated him, of course, and led to harsher restrictions on the Christians. He began by banning believers from teaching grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. He made the requirements for school teachers so stringently pagan that no Christian could fulfill them. Banished from the public square, Christianity could be minimized as a cultural force. Yet Julian had retained the appearance of religious freedom. Believers remained free to do and think whatever they wanted on Sundays, as long as they didn't let it seep into the wider society from 9 to 5 on Monday through Saturday. According to a recent biographer, this was Julian's masterstroke. Julian marginalized Christianity to the point where it could potentially have vanished within a generation or two, and without the need for physical coercion. As Julian said of the Christians, if they want to learn literature, they have Luke and Mark. Let them go back to their churches and expound on them. Julian wanted to remove Christians from public discourse, neutralize their public influence, and drive them into a cultural ghetto. And briefly, he succeeded. It was not to last, however. As Julian shook the dust of Antioch from his feet, he marched his troops toward Persia, and to their devastating defeat at the hands of the Persian Emperor Shapur II. On the battlefield at the Persian frontier, Julian fell hard, and with him the Eastern Empire began to crumble. According to one account, he was struck by a spear and suddenly saw matters clearly. According to some reports, his last words were, "You win, O Galilean." Julian's death was a critical moment in the fall of the Old Empire. His biographer, Adrian Murdoch, concludes, "To all intents and purposes, we can say that paganism died as a credible political and social force in the last days of June, 363. And in such ends, Christians found a new beginning." The historian Robert Royle gives us an excellent summary answer to the question of why Julian failed. The Church Fathers cited supernatural causes and the hand of providence, but grace builds on nature, and Julian's old project died of abundant natural causes. Bear with me, please, while I quote Royle's summary at length. It's brilliant. Julian crafted one of the strongest early critiques of Christian beliefs and made great efforts to stop Christianity's growth as a social force in the empire. Yet Julian conceded, in a realistic appraisal of what he had to overcome, that the Christian churches were carrying out relief efforts among the poor, pagan as well as Christian, that the pagans themselves were not. Julian and the whole classical world suffered two disadvantages in competing with the new faith. First, there was no substantial set of principles within classical religion and philosophy to inspire such charitable works. The Stoics had come closest with their conception of the entire world as one city, the cosmopolis. But by Julian's day, Platonism was the only real pagan philosophy still standing, and even the old Stoic principle was a far cry from the active and lively sense of the universal brotherhood and sisterhood within the kingdom of God that the Christians called caritas. Had such ideas been influential in pagan societies, they would not have faced a second problem: the absence of the social structures needed to implement large-scale works of charity. The empire and its municipalities sometimes provided a public dole, but love and empowerment of the common people is something quite different from a state subsidy. No ancient city, let alone the whole empire, had ever attempted that. In the world of late antiquity, Christianity introduced not only new beliefs and ideas, but new social practices that transformed ancient Mediterranean life. Julian could not manufacture the sort of love that drove the Christians during centuries of persecution to establish a network, a system, a society, a culture of voluntary mutual care and support. What Christians were willing to do for God, no one in his right mind would do for a program as boring as Julian's. It may be sweet and beautiful, as the pagans said, to die for one's country, but few people seemed willing to turn over their tithe for Rome or volunteer for pagan soup kitchens. They asked a sensible question. Isn't that what our taxes are for? And they went back to their games of horseshoes and checkers. Julian had great ambitions for reshaping society, and when he failed spectacularly. Yet Julian has fascinated Christians ever since. I sometimes wonder if Julian was the model for the main character in Flannery O'Connor's brilliant novel Wise Blood. The character's name is Hazel Motes. A war veteran scarred by his experiences, he rejects the Christianity of his upbringing, and he lives in rebellion against the Christian God. He wanders the South, preaching what he calls the church without Christ. Well, one of his would-be followers is a scam artist who sees Hazel's new religion as an opportunity to make a lot of money. So he appoints himself as Hazel's apostle. But he doesn't understand Hazel's religious rebellion at all, and he preaches what he calls the Holy Church of Christ without Christ. The Holy Church of Christ without Christ. That's what Julian wanted. A worldwide gathering of do-gooders, imagining there's no heaven, it's easy if you try, and no hell below us, above us only sky. The results for Julian and for Hazel Motes would be tragic and the stuff of Christian satire. The problem is that without Christ there is no holiness on earth. Without Christ there is no such unity as we find in the church. What's more, there is no such thing as human dignity, human equality, and human freedom. There is no reliable foundation for universal brotherhood or the hope for world peace. All of these things came about as a result of the Christian Revolution. In the pagan world, there was no talk of just war. There was no such thing as a hospital. No one was floating the idea that a slave was equal to his master. In pagan Rome, it had been legal to rape or kill a slave. Christianity changed the way the world looks at itself, composes itself, and thinks about life. We may no longer recognize this or remember, but we may learn the hard way that it is true. We may acknowledge the failure of secularism and the idolatry of the state only when it has failed to feed us and heal us and save us from our enemies. Two ways there are, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the two ways. There is a vicious rumor about that the early Christians converted the world by promising everyone pie in the sky when we die by and by. There is another rumor that the early Christians converted pagans by making them fearful of hell. The truth is that the fathers of the church hardly mention heaven and hell at all. Oh, they believed in the last things, but they knew that eternity broke into time right now, whenever the church gathered for the Mass. They were more concerned with the ways you and I might make the world more heavenly where we live, or make it more hellish. Two ways there are, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the two ways. Two roads diverge in our wood. Let us choose the way of Basil, even as our world tries to drag us the way of Julian. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of our series. The Way of the Fathers is listener-funded, so we're dependent on the generosity of people like you. Pay us a visit at catholicculture.org. We pray for our benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.